and welcome. In our lesson today, we are going to discuss the fascinating topic of blood. Now, blood is not just a single substance. You have a variety of components that make up blood. Now, each of these components has essential functions that it carries out. Now, what are the components of blood? Now, the components of blood are as follows. We have the plasma, we have the blood cells. These, of course, are the red blood cells, also known as erythrocytes, the white blood cells, and you also have the platelets, also known as the thrombocytes. Now, as you can imagine, if we are going to discuss the structure and function of each of these components, the video is going to be quite long, and I don't want that. I find that shorter videos are usually better for both of us. So what I'll do is, I'll divide this lesson into two bits, into two videos. So for this video, we are going to talk about the structure and function of the plasma and the red blood cells. Now, in the next part of the lesson, a video that I'll be releasing soon enough, inshallah, I will focus on the white blood cells and of course the platelets, including the blood clotting process. So make sure to check it out. Let us start with the first component, the plasma. So what is the plasma? Now, the plasma is the main component of blood. Now, it's a pale yellow fluid. 90% of the plasma is just simply water. Just hit that. 90% of the plasma is water, and the plasma is the main component of blood. So essentially, this means that the main component of blood is just water. Now, what do we have in the plasma? We have such a variety of substances. We have blood proteins. Now, blood proteins are also known as plasma proteins. So these are a group of proteins that are usually found in blood. Now, this is where we have fibrinogen, we have albumin, and we also have antibodies. So let's start with fibrinogen. Now, fibrinogen is the plasma protein that is responsible or that takes part in blood clotting. We'll discuss more of this when we get to part 2 of the video. So fibrinogen is involved in blood clotting. What about albumin? Now, albumin is another type of plasma protein that plays a role in maintaining the osmotic pressure of blood. Lastly, antibodies. Do I even need to talk about this? Now, antibodies are a type of protein that are a crucial component of our immune system. So they fight against pathogens which will cause diseases. So these are 3 types of plasma proteins that are present in our blood. Now, this, of course, is also a common question that students are asked. They are told, for example, list the plasma proteins that are present in blood and maybe explain their function. If you get such a question, then you already have more Kenya for that, right? Now, proceeding. Remember where we are discussing the components that make up the plasma. Moving on. Now, this is where we also have dissolved food substances like the glucose, amino acids, lipids, vitamins. You also have hormones and enzymes present. More than that, you also have waste products like carbon dioxide and urea present in plasma. Now, I know, you're probably thinking, hey, usinimchuzi mix, and yes. Essentially, whatever is needed by our body, either required by the tissues or to be eliminated, as in the case of the waste products, is going to be present in blood. Now, why, in case you're wondering why this is so, just remember that the main function, one of the main functions of blood is transportation of materials. So moving materials to where they're needed. So all of these substances that are present within the plasma are simply being transported from one part of the body to the other. And that is why you have such a variety of substances. Now, that is the plasma and the substances that are usually present within it. Let's move on to the next bit. What are the functions of the plasma? So I'll just mention around 4 or 5 of these functions. The first one, we're going to focus on the red blood cells. So we talk about blood cells, like the red blood cells and the white blood cells being present in the plasma. Now let's start with the red blood cells. Red blood cells are being transported by the plasma from one part of the body to another. Essentially, they are being transported to tissues. And the reason for this is because red blood cells contain oxygen. So this oxygen is required by tissues in order to carry out respiration. So the plasma acts as a medium of transport. It transports the oxygen, which contains, it transports the red blood cells, which contains oxygen, to the tissues. Now, another bit is the white blood cells. Now, white blood cells are the warriors in our body. So they fight against pathogens which will otherwise cause diseases. So what happens is that the plasma also transports the white blood cells to where they are needed in order to fight pathogens. Another bit or another function of the plasma is that it plays a crucial role in maintaining the temperature within our body. Now, how does it do so? You find that when our bodies are active, for example, when our bodies carry out certain physical activities, there's a lot of heat that is usually produced. Now, this is because during physical activities, our bodies require a lot of energy. Why? Okay, for the physical activities. Now, this energy is produced through respiration. Now, when energy is produced, heat is also released. So you find that the plasma absorbs the heat from these respiring tissues and then transports it to different parts of the body. So essentially what it does is that it distributes the heat. Now the reason why the plasma can do this is because it has a high heat capacity. So it plays a role in distribution of heat throughout the body, and therefore it plays a role in thermoregulation. So the plasma also plays a role in removal of waste products. So what this means is that you are going to have waste products within the plasma like carbon dioxide and urea. So carbon dioxide, for example, will need to be transported to the lungs where it can then be excreted. How, you ask? Through exhalation. So plasma plays a role in transportation of waste products, metabolic waste products, to organs where they can then be excreted, to excretory organs. Now another function of the plasma is transportation of hormones. Now, hormones are transported from endocrine glands to target organs. Okay, pause. Let's break that down. What are endocrine glands? Endocrine glands are simply organs that, number one, produce hormones and then secrete these hormones into the blood. So they secrete the hormones directly into the blood. Now, hormones act as chemical messengers. They control different physiological processes that occur within our body. So when the hormones are released into the blood, the plasma, which is the main component of blood, transports the hormones to the target organs. These are the places in the body where the hormones are supposed to act upon. Correct? Understood? So the hormones are transported from where they're produced to where they need to work. Now, another function, my last function actually of the plasma, is that it helps in regulation of the pH of body fluid. So those are the functions of the plasma. Now, if you found this interesting, wait until we reach the red blood cells part, and I promise you it's going to be captivating. Now, if you're finding this video informative, please subscribe if you haven't done so already, and hit the comment button. Now, let's move on to the red blood cells. Now, this is my favorite bit. First, we are going to talk about how the red blood cells are formed. Now, red blood cells are formed by the bone marrow of short bones. Let's break that down. What is the bone marrow? Now, the bone marrow is a soft, spongy tissue that is found inside some bones in our body. You know, sometimes when you've made a stew or soup and there's this, creamy something inside of the bones, and you pull it out and it tastes so delicious. That is the bone marrow. So the bone marrow of short bones, for example, the sternum, the breastbone, or the bones of the vertebrae, your backbone. Now the bone marrow of these bones is essentially responsible for the formation of red blood cells. Now, moving on to the structure. What is the structure of the red blood cells? Now, the red blood cells have a distinctive shape. And this shape is referred to as the biconcave shape. Now, don't ever talk about the shape of the red blood cells as being spherical, circular, biconcave. Now, apart from the shape, red blood cells are also numerous. You have so many red blood cells in the body. Now, I want to tell you this. If you were to take 1 cubic millimeter of blood, 1 cubic millimeter of blood, now you're going to end up finding that in that cubic millimeter, they are going to be around, wait for this, 5 million red blood cells. Just imagine that. Now I know you're probably thinking, 1 cubic millimeter? Now Now, let me give you an example that you'll find easy to relate to. You know the droppers we use for practicals, the droppers. Now, if you want to pour out one drop, I want you to close your eyes, visualize this, one drop. Mentally, just divide that drop into around 20 parts. Now, take that one tiny part. Now, I want you to imagine that is the equivalent to 1 cubic millimeter. So in that small, tiny portion, you're going to have around 5 million red blood cells. Wow, impossible to imagine, right? But it's the truth. So, remember when we talked about the plasma, we mentioned the plasma as being a pale yellow fluid. But in reality, whenever we see blood, it's red in color. And this is because it comes back to the red blood cells. So the red blood cells contain a red pigment known as hemoglobin. And because the red blood cells are so numerous, the overall color of blood tends to be red. So hemoglobin is known as the respiratory pigment because this is the pigment or the compound that combines with oxygen and carbon dioxide for transport. Now, apart from hemoglobin, what else about the structure of the red blood cells? Now, another distinctive characteristic of the red blood cell is that they lack nucleus. In fact, they not only lack nucleus, they also have very few organelles. So most of the organelles that are present within a normal cell are absent in the red blood cell. So on maturity, they lose the nucleus. They also lose a lot of the organelles. Now, this is by design. The extra space that would have been occupied by nucleus and the other organelles is now used for packaging of hemoglobin. So essentially this means that if you have more hemoglobin, the red blood cells are going to be more efficient in transportation of respiratory gases. FYI, when we talk about respiratory gases, we are simply referring to oxygen and carbon dioxide. Now, where was I? Yes. The distinctive structure of the red blood cells. So we've talked about the red blood cell having a biconcave shape. We've mentioned that they lack the nucleus and most other organelles. And another thing about the red blood cells is that within the red blood cells, you're going to have an enzyme. The name of this enzyme is known as carbonic anhydrase. Now, we'll mention more about this enzyme when we talk about transportation of carbon dioxide. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention this about hemoglobin. So hemoglobin is the respiratory pigment. You know, it facilitates transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide. Now, hemoglobin is a protein. Actually, it's a conjugated protein. Now, a conjugated protein, this is a term that was mentioned in nutrition form 1 under the discussion of proteins. A conjugated protein is essentially a compound that consists of a protein part and a non-protein part. So in the case of hemoglobin, the protein part is the globin, you know, globin, and the non-protein part is the heme. So it consists of iron. Now, hemoglobin is a conjugated protein. Now, hemoglobin has a very high affinity for oxygen. This simply means that when in areas where there is a high concentration of oxygen, such as in the lungs, hemoglobin readily combines and binds to oxygen as such, you know. So it easily takes up oxygen, combines with it to form a compound known as oxyhemoglobin. Now, this will be discussed in our next part, just right now, when we talk about transportation of oxygen. One last thing regarding the red blood cells. So the red blood cells have an expiry date, you know. Okay, an expiry date means you know what it is. Now, they have a very short lifespan of around 120 days, that is roughly 4 months, yes. So you find that with red blood cells, as they age, they become less flexible and therefore it becomes difficult for them to maneuver through narrow parts of the body to transport oxygen and such. So they are simply broken down and recycled. Now, this is something that is discussed in detail at the end of Form 2 syllabus in the topic of excretion and homeostasis. The function of the red blood cell. The function of the red blood cell is to carry out transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So it transports oxygen from the lungs, the alveoli specifically, to the tissues where it's required to carry out respiration. Now, another function of the red blood cell is that it also transports carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is transported from the tissues to the lungs where it's then excreted. Now, before we proceed to transportation of oxygen and carbon dioxide, I would like to discuss something that is usually tested on, and that is the adaptations of the red blood cells. So, how is the structure of the red blood cell essential in performing its functions? So, let us discuss this. Number one, the biconcave shape. So red blood cells have a biconcave shape which increases the surface area for the diffusion of respiratory gases. Now I would like to point out this. Don't talk about to provide a surface area. Always use the term increasing the surface area or providing a large surface area for the diffusion of the respiratory gases. Now, diffusion is the physiological process that is involved in movement of oxygen and carbon dioxide from one part of the body to another. Moving on to another adaptation, and that is linked to the absence of the nucleus. So the red blood cells lack nucleus and most other organelles. So this provides more space for packaging of hemoglobin. So of course, it makes the whole process of transport of respiratory gases more efficient. Moving on to another function of the red blood cells, they contain an enzyme. So within the red blood cells, you have an enzyme by the name of carbonic anhydrase. This enzyme works in or facilitates the transport of carbon dioxide. Now this is something we'll discuss in a little bit. Now another adaptation of the red blood cell is that they have a thin plasma membrane. Pause. Let me take you back to Form 1, diffusion. Factors affecting the rate of diffusion. Now one of those factors was the thickness of the tissues or membranes. So we're talking about diffusion happening. Now in order to ensure that diffusion occurs at a very fast rate, what will need to happen is that the plasma membrane, essentially the membrane of the red blood cell, will need to be very thin. Why? To reduce the distance across which the respiratory gases diffuse. This of course will end up making transportation of the respiratory gases more efficient. Now another function of the red blood, another adaptation of the red blood cell is that it contains hemoglobin. Now, hemoglobin is the respiratory pigment and this has a high affinity for oxygen. So it makes transportation of oxygen to tissues very efficient. Now, I believe those should be enough for the question. So those are adaptations of the red blood cells. Now, let's move on to the next bit. Now, in the next bit, let us discuss how oxygen is transported by the red blood cells. Now, oxygen is transported by red blood cells because the red blood cells contain hemoglobin. So, as stated before, hemoglobin has a high affinity to oxygen. So, it readily binds to oxygen when in areas where oxygen concentration is high. Now, in the lungs, specifically in the alveoli, you will find that the concentration of oxygen is quite high. Now, I want to mention something. Movement, as stated, occurs by diffusion. And if you want diffusion to take place, you need to have a concentration gradient. So what is a concentration gradient? Essentially, this is a difference in the concentration of molecules between two regions. So what this means is that if we want oxygen to diffuse, we need to have different concentrations of oxygen between two regions. Now, where are we right now? We are in the lungs, specifically in the alveoli. Now, in the alveoli, you have a high concentration of oxygen. Remember, this is because of the inhaled air. Now, surrounding the alveoli are blood vessels. The concentration of oxygen in the blood vessels is quite low compared to that in the alveoli. So, ding, we have a concentration gradient. So that means diffusion can take place. So oxygen will diffuse from the region of high concentration to the region of low concentration. You remember this bit? So oxygen diffuses from within the alveoli across the epithelial membrane and into the blood. In the blood, we have the red blood cells containing hemoglobin. So hemoglobin swoops in, takes up the oxygen, combines with it and forms oxyhemoglobin. Now, the oxygen is ready for transport. So it's transported to the tissues. Now, once at the tissues, what happens? We need oxygen to diffuse from the blood and into the tissues. What needs to happen? What needs to be present? Tell me.
Concentration gradient.
Very good, a concentration gradient. So we need to have a concentration gradient whenever diffusion needs to take place. Now, do we have one? Yes, of course. So oxygen concentration right now in the blood vessels is quite high compared to that within the tissues. Remember, the tissues are continuously carrying out respiration using up oxygen. So the concentration of oxygen in the tissues is lower than that in the blood vessels. What happens next? Diffusion, of course. Now, on this bit, I would like to mention something, acclimatization. Now, what is acclimatization? This is essentially a process that occurs when you have an individual moving to a new environment and the body needs to adapt to changing environmental conditions like temperature, like altitude, and so on. So our bodies have that marvelous ability. You know, when you go to a new area where the conditions, the environmental conditions are different, our body gradually adapts to those conditions. Now, I want to discuss this with regards to transport of oxygen, specifically for altitude. Now, in areas that have a high altitude, what happens is that the concentration of oxygen tends to be lower. So this means that the body needs to adapt to ensure that the amount of oxygen that is still transported is enough for the functions. Now, how does it do so? Number one is that the number of red blood cells that are produced by your body are increased. Now, number two is that the content of hemoglobin present within the red blood cells is also increased. Now, this is all done to ensure that the process of transportation of oxygen is still as efficient as possible. And that is transportation of oxygen. Moving on. Let's just take a breath, Take this time to subscribe and like. Now, moving on. Transportation of carbon 4 oxide. Now, carbon 4 oxide, transportation of carbon 4 oxide is quite unique in that it occurs in several forms. Now, let's start with the first one. So the first one is in form of weak carbonic acid. Now, around 5% of carbon 4 oxide dissolves in plasma. Let's pause there. I want to take you back to chemistry. Now, one of the characteristics of carbon 4 oxide is that it's slightly soluble in water. And remember, plasma, the main component of plasma is simply water. So around 5% of carbon 4 oxide dissolves in the plasma to form weak carbonic acid, and it is transported as such. Now, moving on to the other way in which carbon 4 oxide is transported. It's transported in form of carbaminohemoglobin. Beautiful name, right? Now, hemoglobin also has the ability to combine with carbon 4 oxide. So it combines with carbon 4 oxide to form carbaminohemoglobin. This, of course, is an unstable compound. This simply means that when the red blood cells reach the lungs, the carbaminohemoglobin compound dissociates, forming hemoglobin and carbon 4 oxide. So what happens is that the carbon 4 oxide then diffuses into the alveoli where it's excreted. How? By exhalation. Now, what happens to the hemoglobin, the poor hemoglobin that has been left behind? It simply goes back. So it goes back looking for more oxygen or carbon 4 oxide to bind with. Now, this is around 10% of carbon 4 oxide that is transported in this form. Now, majority of carbon 4 oxide, around 85% of carbon 4 oxide is transported in form of bicarbonate ions. Now, remember the enzyme we mentioned? The enzyme that is present in red blood cells. Now, this enzyme is referred to as carbonic anhydrase. So, essentially, the function of this enzyme is to catalyze the reaction between carbon 4 oxide and water. This leads to the formation of weak carbonic acid. So, most of the carbon 4 oxide that diffuses into the red blood cell reacts with water to form weak carbonic acid. This reaction is catalyzed by the enzyme carbonic anhydrase. Now, what happens is that once the weak carbonic acid has been formed, it dissociates. Now, it dissociates to form two ions, bicarbonate ions and hydrogen ions. Now, the bicarbonate ions are the form in which carbon 4 oxide is mostly transported to the lungs. Now, once in the lungs, the bicarbonate ions simply dissociate to form carbon 4 oxide, which diffuses into the alveoli for removal. So this is the main form in which carbon 4 oxide is excreted. Now, one thing, again, a question that is frequently asked is this. What is the main advantage of transporting carbon 4 oxide in the form of bicarbonate ion? Actually, there are two reasons. Reason number one is that because of the presence of enzyme carbonic hydrase, it makes this whole process very efficient. So enzyme carbonic hydrase helps in the loading and offloading of carbon 4 oxide. This simply means combining and dissociation of carbon 4 oxide. So it makes the whole process very efficient. Now, another reason is that when in the form of bicarbonate ions, the carbon 4 oxide cannot affect the pH of the body fluids. What do I mean by this? So pH refers to a measure of the acidity or alkalinity of a substance. Now, just imagine if most of the carbon 4 oxide was being transported as weak carbonic acid. Just imagine. What will happen, or how will this affect the pH of the blood? It will drastically affect it. Thankfully, that is not the case. Now, when it's transported in the form of bicarbonate ion, what happens is that it does not alter the pH of the blood. So win-win situation. So these are the two reasons why it's actually advantageous for the body to transport it in the bicarbonate form. And that is that. So a recap, let me just recap please. Carbon 4 oxide is transported in three ways. Now around 5% of it is transported as weak carbonic acid. So some carbon 4 oxide dissolves in the plasma, forming the weak carbonic acid. Around 10% is transported in the form of carbaminohemoglobin. This is where you have hemoglobin combining with carbon 4 oxide to form an unstable compound. Last and most, so this is the main way in which carbon 4 oxide is transported. It's transported in the form of bicarbonate ions. And this reaction is catalyzed by enzyme carbonic anhydrase present within the red blood cells. And that, ladies and gentlemen, brings us to the end of this very productive lesson. It's packed with information. I hope that it's been beneficial for you. So see you in our next lesson where I'll be discussing the white blood cells and the platelets. See you there.